Have you ever wondered where the actual blueprint for modern India's government came from? It's a story that goes way deeper than just the freedom struggle. For over 200 years, the British were laying down the tracks, one law at a time. So today, we're going to dig in and see exactly how a private company's rule, slowly, piece by piece, became the administrative DNA of a nation.
But let's start with a question that sounds kind of nuts. How does a private company, a for-profit corporation, end up conquering an entire subcontinent? And no, that's not a metaphor. That is literally what happened with the East India Company.
Okay, so check out this timeline. In 1600, they're just traders, right? Dealing in spices and textiles. But then, fast forward about 150 years, and boom, they're a massive political and military power. How did that happen? Well, it was a mix of battles, clever deals, and one absolute game changer, getting the Diwani. This is where the story really takes a turn.
So what exactly was this Diwani? Well, imagine getting a deal where you collect all the profits, but you have zero responsibility for any of the problems. That's basically what the company got. They were given the right to collect taxes from millions of people in the incredibly wealthy regions of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Meanwhile, the local rulers were stuck actually running the place. It was the ultimate corporate takeover, and it made the company unbelievably wealthy.
Now you can probably guess what happened next. A private company with its own army, running a tax system for millions of people, it became insanely powerful and corrupt. Its employees were coming back to England dripping in wealth. So, back in London, the British Parliament looked at this whole situation and realized this rogue creation of theirs was completely out of control. It was time to put a leash on it.
Their first big move was this, the Regulating Act of 1773. And honestly, the clue is right there in the name. This wasn't a takeover, not yet anyway. It was the first real attempt to regulate the company, to give it some structure, and to bring it under the supervision of the British government for the very first time.
And their master plan boiled down to one key idea: centralization. See, before this, the company's territories in Bengal, Bombay, and Madras were kind of like three separate little kingdoms, all doing their own thing. This act brought them all under one roof, with one big boss in Bengal, Lord Warren Hastings. This was a huge step towards creating a single, unified British authority in India, and it laid down a foundation that would last for nearly 2 centuries.
All right, next up we have Pitt's India Act, and this is where things get really clever. The government set up this system of dual control. Think of it like this. The company could still run the day-to-day business, the commercial stuff. But the government, through a new board of control, was now the real manager, calling the shots on all the important stuff: military, civil, and revenue affairs. The big takeaway here? The British government was now officially in the driver's seat.
And words matter. A lot. This act included what seems like a tiny change in phrasing, but with massive implications. The company's lands were no longer just corporate assets. They were now officially called the British possessions in India. The mask was slipping. This wasn't just about a company anymore. It was about an empire.
So that whole centralization process that began back in 1773, well, it pretty much reached its final form with the Charter Act of 1833. The job title got an upgrade. The Governor-General of Bengal was now the Governor-General of India. The first person to hold that title was Lord William Bentinck, and it gave him ultimate authority over every single civil and military issue across all British territories.
For almost a century, Britain had ruled India through this awkward and complicated partnership with a private company. But then, one single explosive event came along and brought that entire system crashing down, forcing the crown to finally step out from behind the curtain.
And that event was the Great Rebellion of 1857. It started as a mutiny among soldiers, but quickly erupted into a massive uprising that shook the very foundations of British power. Now, the rebellion was eventually put down, but it proved one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt to everyone in London. Trying to rule a subcontinent through a for-profit company was a disaster waiting to happen. The company had to go.
And just like that, the game was completely reset. The Government of India Act of 1858 changed everything. The East India Company, abolished. That whole dual control system, scrapped. Power was now held directly by the British Crown. The top official in India, Lord Canning, was no longer just a Governor-General. He was now the Viceroy, the Queen's direct personal representative. A whole new era had just begun.
But taking direct control created a totally new kind of problem. The British realized that the 1857 rebellion happened in part because they were ruling in a complete bubble. with no real clue what the people of India were actually thinking. Now they had to figure out how to manage a subcontinent that was starting to find its voice and demand to be heard.
So that's the new puzzle for the British Raj. How do you maintain absolute control, but at the same time at least give the impression that you're listening? Well, the answer came in a series of very cautious, very calculated, and very reluctant concessions.
The very first of these concessions was the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Now, for the first time ever, some Indians, like the Raja of Benares and the Maharaja of Patala, were invited into the room where laws were being made. But, and this is a huge but, they were only non-official members. That meant they could talk, they could give their opinions, but they couldn't vote. It was a symbolic gesture, really. A way to say we hear you without actually giving up any real power.
And want to know how big this new expanded council was? The one meant to represent a subcontinent of millions? A grand total of 16 additional members, both British and Indian. That's it. It was less of a parliament and more of a small committee.
Okay, now let's jump forward almost 50 years to the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909. That number, 16, gets bumped up to 60. So we are seeing some gradual expansion. But the real story of this act wasn't about the size of the council, it was about how some of its members would be chosen.
This act introduced a concept that would literally alter the course of Indian history: separate electorates. The idea was simple, but its consequences were massive. Initially, this was for Muslims, and it meant that Muslim voters would only vote for Muslim candidates to fill specially reserved seats. This was the first time the voting public was legally divided along religious lines, and it created ripples that we still feel today.
And for that very reason, the viceroy at the time, Lord Minto, gets a pretty heavy title in the history books, the father of communal electorate. This policy of dividing representation by community would only be expanded in the years to come, and it profoundly shaped the political landscape of India in ways that are still debated to this day.
All right, let's get into the final phase before independence. As the demands for self-rule got louder and louder, the British started introducing more complex reforms. And what's fascinating is that if you look closely at these reforms, you can actually see the clear building blocks of the government structures that India uses right now.
The Government of India Act of 1919 was a really big one. It introduced a bicameral legislature, that's a two-house parliament, which you see in many countries today. It brought in direct elections for the first time ever. It also created a clever system in the provinces called diarchy, which split government departments between British and Indian control. And it set up a public service commission to recruit civil servants based on merit. These are all the bones of a modern state.
But let's look at the fine print on those direct elections. The right to vote? It was basically reserved for the elite. If you didn't own a certain amount of property, pay enough taxes, or have a certain level of education, you were out. So yeah, it was a step towards democracy, but it was a very, very small step for a very small group of people. And all of this brings us to one last really big question. A centralized government, a Supreme Court, a professional civil service, a two-house parliament, so many of the institutions that are fundamental to India today were born out of these British laws. It really makes you think. How much of a nation's identity is shaped not just by its own triumphs and choices, but by the blueprint left behind by its former rulers?